Good day, everyone. We are here to make a presentation on INHS 101 with the topic From Historical Trauma to Present Day Realities, the Mental Health Effect of Residential Schools on Indigenous People, which is presented by
Jashanpreet
and Olabinde Akitunde.
Faith, Isosa Faith Ogiade. Residential schools were one of the major colonial structures which was designated to erase indigenous people of their identities and cultural ties. The long-lasting traumatic impact of the residential schools can still be felt till date, with the effect on the mental, emotion, and overall well-being of the indigenous people and communities across generations. The presentation highlights the long-lasting mental health challenges and the need to recognize historical trauma in order to solve the current day mental health issues faced by the indigenous people. So this is an example of one of the residential schools, and this school here is the British Columbia School, which was opened in early 1860s and remained operational until 1984. That means that the presidential school were not just ancient histories. People who attended these schools are still alive up to this moment. That is, there are still weaknesses of those who passed through the traumas, whether their children and their grandchildren are still alive.
So the next we are going to discuss about is the residential schools as a simulation tool, as residential schools were closely tied to the Indian Act, which was passed in 1876. The Indian Act would give the government the power, the control over education, governance, identity, and land. So over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were forcibly removed from their schools, from their families and communities, and they were put into the residential schools. So the major goal was to separate the children from their language, their community, their culture and identities. In many schools, the children experienced not only physical and emotional punishments, but also spiritual and sexual abuses. Many children died in the school because of the diseases, the malnutrition, neglect and abuse. And the experiences not only caused the short-term effects, but also the long-term and deep wounds, like breaking down the family bonds, interrupted passing down of cultural knowledge, and disconnecting from their families. So the people were disconnected completely from their communities and the knowledge and the sense of self. So all of this have the direct effect not only on their physical health, but also the mental and the mental health. Like they were not able to trust again, they were not able to interact with the healthcare, education and childcare anymore. So next we are going to discuss intergenerational trauma and its mental effect. So this trauma from the residential school is intergenerational, which means it doesn't stay only with the survivors. It is passed on to the children, grandchildren and on to future generations. So this trauma is passed down in several ways. Firstly, it has led to the disruptions in the parenting and family roles, on which people grew up in the schools were not raised with love, safety and healthy parenting services. Secondly, children in the schools were punished in several ways, either for speaking their language or practicing their culture. As a consequence, they lost their sense of belongingness and connection to their roots, their language and ceremonies. Moreover, families carry connection. Moreover, there was grief, unsolved trauma and suppressed families' histories, as the most of the children were went missing and many of them suffered abuse. This unspoken trauma creates tension, silence and emotional distance within the families, and many survivors still experience the long-term effects on their mental health, like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. So as we can say, it's not an individual issue, it's a collective and community shared trauma that affects the whole indigenous nation. Next is the current day mental health impacts. So today we can clearly see the impacts of this residential schools on the ongoing colonialism in the mental health statistics and experiences among this indigenous people. Indigenous people high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, as I already discussed in the previous slide. So many people are also diagnosed with the several conditions like substance use disorder and many eating disorders, bipolar disorder. These conditions do not come out of nowhere. They were the result of historical trauma, ongoing racism, and social conditions. So because of all this past and present experiences of racism, stereotyping, and discrimination, many indigenous people, they avoid seeking help. They may not believe or they receive poor quality of care. So all this practice shows how the mental health today are directly linked to the colonial policies, and it's not just an individual choice and biology, it's community and shared trauma among all the indigenous community.
Okay, so I'll continue on the ongoing colonial policies and health inequalities. So colonialism didn't end with the residential school. Many inequalities can still be seen in today, such as limited access to proper health care, inadequate housing, and persistent underfunding, which still affect indigenous community and their mental health. So when we talk about limited access to proper health care, we know that there are some areas in the indigenous community that experience limited health services, limited mental health professionals, and also long wait time. When we talk about inadequate housing, the overcrowdedness of the housing system, as is the reserves, can also mentally affect the health and well-being of the indigenous people. Then persistent underfunding, which affects, so there's little or no funding to indigenous health and well-being programs for the indigenous people. So also systemic racism across public services as a result of colonization continues to shape modern systems, which shows that in order to experience a meaningful change, the structural roots of these inequalities must be addressed by honoring truth and reconciling for the future. So it's trying to let us know that if we really want change in Canada, it's not only about the mental health wellness. We also need to address the structural root of the inequalities. In addressing the structural root of the inequalities, we need to tackle roots problems that grow out from colonization. So addressing this would enable us to recognize that there's intergenerational trauma as a result of residential school. Then if we're going to reconcile for the future, there must be a recognition. They must be able to listen to the indigenous voice. They must be able to make changes in their laws. Next slide. Okay, the conclusion. Sorry, the conclusion slide. Okay, so despite the long-lasting emotional and mental health issues as a result of intergenerational trauma of the residential schools, the indigenous people and community continue to yield true resilient indigenous teachings, cultural practices such as the medicine wheel, smudging ceremonies, connection to land, and also togetherness. So however, there must be a continuous collaborative efforts between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and also the indigenous people to invest more on culturally grounded healing programs. An example of such culturally grounded healing program would be the First Nations mental wellness framework. This is unique to the First Nation community. So the framework encourages the process of the two-I-saying, where it blends the Western way of treating mental illness and the indigenous way, that is the First Nations mental wellness. So in this blended approach, we can say that the mental issues will be addressed more properly. Then I would conclude by saying, finally, recognizing historical trauma, addressing ongoing colonial policies, and supporting indigenous-led solutions are all necessary steps if Canada truly wants to move towards truth, reconciliation, and mental wellness for indigenous people. These are the selected references. Next slide, please. Then thank you all for listening.